The summer of 1864 in the hills of Georgia was not merely a season. It was a physical oppression, a heavy blanket of humidity and red dust that clogged the lungs and obscured the horizon. For the men of the 9th Indiana Infantry, the campaign to seize Atlanta had devolved from a series of strategic maneuvers into a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare of entrenchments and attrition. Among these hardened veterans rode Lieutenant Ambrose Bierce, a young topographical engineer on the staff of General William B. Hazen. At 21, Bierce possessed a mind as sharp and unforgiving as the terrain he was tasked to map, a landscape he viewed not with the romanticism of the early war years, but with the cold, dissecting eye of a technician recording the geometry of a slaughterhouse. Bierce's role as a topographical officer placed him in a unique and precarious position within the hierarchy of the federal war machine. While the line infantryman's world was confined to the few yards of dirt in front of his rifle pit, Bierce was required to see the battlefield in its totality. He ventured beyond the relative safety of the main lines, utilizing his compass and sketchbook to document the ridges, ravines, and enemy fortifications that would dictate the flow of blood. This duty demanded a peculiar form of detached bravery, the ability to function intellectually while under the constant threat of annihilation. He was not merely fighting the war, he was studying it, reducing the chaos of combat to contour lines and elevation markers. The road to Kennesaw Mountain had been paved with the carnage of previous engagements. The 9th Indiana was a regiment with a storied and bloody pedigree, having seen action at Philippi, the very first organized land battle of the conflict, and later at the horrors of Shiloh and Stones River. At Shiloh, Bierce had witnessed the grotesque aftermath of industrial warfare, the swine feeding on the unburied dead, the wounded trapped in burning underbrush, images that burned away any lingering idealism and left behind a residue of profound cynicism. By June 1864, the regiment was a mechanism of war, stripped of vanity, operating with the fatalistic efficiency of survivors who knew their luck was a finite resource. The meteorological conditions of June 1864 exacerbated the misery of the campaign. For weeks, torrential rains had turned the Georgia clay into a viscous quagmire, stalling Major General William T. Sherman's advance and confining the men to miserable, waterlogged bivouacs. By the third week of June, however, the rain ceased, replaced by a stifling, stagnant heat that caused temperatures to soar near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air grew heavy and still, amplifying the stench of the unburied dead from the skirmishing lines and the pervasive odor of latrines and unwashed bodies. It was an atmosphere conducive to disease and short tempers, where the psychological strain of constant vigilance began to fracture the nerves of even the most experienced soldiers. On the morning of June 23, 1864, the atmosphere along the Kennesaw line was taut with anticipation. General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army of Tennessee had constructed a formidable defensive network anchored on the twin peaks of Big and Little Kennesaw Mountain. These were not the hasty breastworks of earlier battles, but complex feats of engineering, utilizing the rugged terrain to create interlocking fields of fire and dead angles, where attacking troops could be decimated by enfilading fire. Hazen's brigade was probing the center of this line, near a position that would soon earn the grim sobriquet, the Dead Angle, or Cheatham Hill. Bierce, mounted and exposed, moved through the dense pine forests and tangled undergrowth. The terrain was treacherous, a series of steep ridges and deep ravines that broke the cohesion of the advancing columns and limited visibility to mere yards. The Confederate sharpshooters, armed with English Whitworth rifles and Enfields, infested the high ground. These marksmen were professionals, targeting officers with terrifying precision at ranges that exceeded the capabilities of the standard Springfield musket. The zip of Minié balls cutting through the foliage was a constant, unnerving soundtrack to the morning's maneuvers. As a staff officer, Bierce's uniform and his mounted status made him a conspicuous target. Yet he pressed forward, driven by the necessity of his orders to scout the enemy positions. He needed to gauge the steepness of the slopes, the density of the abatis. felled trees with sharpened branches pointing toward the attacker, and the location of the Confederate artillery batteries. It was a task that required him to ride the razor's edge between the Union skirmish lines and the rebel rifle pits. The intensity of the skirmishing increased as the morning wore on. The 9th Indiana pushed against the Confederate pickets, the crack of musketry swelling into a steady roar. The Union artillery began to probe the mountain, their shells bursting in the canopy and raining shrapnel and tree limbs onto the combatants below. In this cauldron of noise and heat, Ambrose Bierce maintained a facade of stoic calm, a soldierly compound of vanity, duty, and the gambler's hope. But beneath the surface, he was acutely aware of the fragility of his existence. He was a man mapping the coordinates of his own potential demise, calculating the geometry of a landscape designed to kill him. The topography of Kennesaw Mountain was not neutral ground. It was a weapon in the hands of the enemy. Every ravine was a potential ambush, every ridge a fortress. As Bierce scanned the tree line, sketching the formidable Confederate works, the war narrowed down to a singular, intense point of focus. The heat waves shimmered off the red earth, distorting the air, and the silence between the rifle shots grew heavy with the promise of violence. The sun had reached its zenith, baking the pine needles and the red clay into a hard, reflective crust. It was now the afternoon of June 23, 1864. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the men of the 9th Indiana as they advanced cautiously through the timber. Lieutenant Bierce moved with the skirmish line, his eyes scanning the dense foliage for the telltale glint of a rifle barrel or the gray smudge of a butternut uniform. The skirmishers moved in open order, darting from tree to tree, their movements jerky and tense. The Confederate fire was disciplined and accurate. The enemy was dug in behind heavy log breastworks, their positions screened by the thick undergrowth. To map these positions, Bierce had to expose himself, to see what the enemy did not want seen. He maneuvered his horse through the brush, risking the attention of the snipers who watched the Union lines like hawks circling prey. Suddenly, the continuity of time snapped. There was no warning, no premonitory sound of the shot. A Confederate bullet, fired perhaps from the rifle of a sniper concealed in the dead angle, struck Bierce in the head. The projectile impacted the temporal region of the skull behind the left ear. It did not graze him. It struck with the shattering force of a hammer blow. Bierce would later struggle to articulate the sensation, describing it not as pain, but as a catastrophic structural failure. He recalled the feeling of his head being broken like a walnut. The impact was kinetic and absolute. The bullet fractured the temporal bone, sending bone fragments inward and lodging the lead projectile dangerously close to the brain matter. He was knocked from his saddle, or his feet. Accounts vary on his exact posture at the moment of impact, the world spinning into a violent, sickening vortex. One moment he was a topographical engineer calculating angles of fire, the next he was a broken object plummeting toward the earth. The forest floor rushed up to meet him, the rough texture of pine bark, the grit of the soil, the smell of resin and blood. He lay in the dirt, the battle continuing its mechanical grind around him. The roar of the conflict seemed to distance itself, retreating behind a wall of high-pitched ringing. Blood poured from the wound, hot and copious, blinding him and pooling in the dust. The traumatic brain injury, TBI, he had sustained was severe. In the medical context of 1864, it was a wound that carried a grim prognosis. Men with such injuries were often left for dead, their survival deemed unlikely by overworked surgeons who practiced triage with brutal efficiency. For an indeterminate amount of time, Ambrose Bierce existed in a state of suspended animation. He was conscious, perhaps, but untethered from reality. The sensory inputs of the battlefield, the heat, the noise, the shouts of men, were filtered through the haze of shock and neurological trauma. He was alone in a profound, internal darkness, a void where the only reality was the rhythmic throbbing of the broken walnut that was his skull. The narrative of his life, which had been writing itself with the vigorous ink of youth and ambition, halted mid-sentence. The ambitious officer, the future literary giant, the cynic, all were extinguished, replaced by a body fighting for its autonomic functions. The war moved on. The 9th Indiana pressed the attack. The dead angle waited. Bierce lay still, a casualty of the geometry he had tried to map. October 1913. 50 years had passed since the guns fell silent, but for the white-haired man standing on the ridge at Chickamauga, the echo of the cannonade was as audible as the rustling of the autumn leaves. Ambrose Bierce, now 71, stood amidst the monuments of the National Military Park, a solitary figure dressed in black, leaning heavily on his cane. He was no longer the dashing lieutenant of topographical engineers. He was a celebrated, feared, and weary man of letters, known to the world as Bitter Bierce, the author of The Devil's Dictionary and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Bierce had left his apartment in Washington, D.C. on October 2, 1913, embarking on a journey that was ostensibly a tour of his old battlefields, but felt, to those who knew him, like a final farewell. He had spent the previous months meticulously settling his affairs, transferring his assets, copyrights, and even his cemetery plot to his daughter, Helen, and his loyal secretary, Carrie Christensen. He was dismantling his life with the same precision he had once applied to his maps. His return to the South was a pilgrimage to the geography of his trauma. He visited Shiloh, where he had seen the swine feeding on the dead, Franklin, where the Confederate Army of Tennessee had destroyed itself in a futile charge, and here, Chickamauga, the scene of a catastrophic Union defeat, where he had served on the staff of General Hazen. The landscape was now peaceful, sanitized by time and memory, but Bierce saw the ghosts. He walked the ground not as a tourist, but as a survivor conducting an inspection of his own history. Bierce's correspondence from this period reveals a man deeply dissatisfied with the prospect of a quiet domestic death. He was plagued by chronic asthma, a condition that left him gasping for breath and reinforced his sense of physical decline. He did not fear death, but he feared the indignity of falling down the cellar stairs, or withering away in a sickbed. In a letter to his niece Laura, dated October 1, 1913, he articulated his desire for a different kind of end. "If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." This was the manifesto of his final journey. Mexico was in the throes of a violent revolution, a chaotic upheaval that promised the kind of elemental conflict Bierce had not seen since 1865. He was drawn to it, pulled by a gravitational force that only an old soldier could understand. He sought to replace the silence of his old age with the roar of the cannon, to trade the slow fade of the invalid for the sharp, definitive punctuation of the firing squad. Leaving the haunted grounds of Tennessee, Bierce traveled south to New Orleans. He arrived in late October, checking into the St. Charles Hotel, a place he remembered from his days as a Treasury agent during Reconstruction. But the city's damp, heavy air was unkind to his lungs. He suffered a severe asthma attack that confined him to his room, leaving him prostrate and gasping. Recovering slightly, he granted an interview to a reporter from the New Orleans States. When asked about his destination, Bierce dropped the mask of the tourist. "I like the game," he told the reporter, his eyes flashing with the old fire. "I want to see it." He spoke of the fighting in Mexico not with horror, but with a professional's curiosity. He dismissed the danger, or rather, he embraced it as the very reason for his trip. From New Orleans, he moved west to San Antonio, Texas. He stayed at the historic Menger Hotel, a gathering place for cattle barons and military officers. He visited Fort Sam Houston, where he was royally entertained by the cavalry officers stationed there. These younger men, professionals of a new century, looked upon the Civil War veteran with a mixture of awe and curiosity. To them, he was a living relic of the Grand Army. To Bierce, they were the inheritors of a trade he knew better than anyone. He watched their drills, critiqued their maneuvers, and perhaps felt a pang of envy for their youth and their proximity to the game. As November began, Bierce moved to Laredo. He was now on the very edge of the United States, looking across the Rio Grande into a country fracturing under the weight of civil war. The order and structure of the U.S. Army posts were behind him. Ahead lay the dust and chaos of the Mexican Revolution. He was ready to cross over. By November 1913, Ambrose Bierce stood on the precipice of a new world. Laredo and El Paso, Texas, served as the gateways to the conflict-consuming Mexico. The revolution against the military dictatorship of Victoriano Huerta had turned the northern states of Mexico into a battleground, dominated by the Constitutionalist Army and its most charismatic and ruthless commander, Pancho Villa. In Laredo, Bierce wrote his final letter to his family. On November 6, 1913, he penned a note to his niece Laura, a message that served as the final severance of his ties to his former life. "I shall not be here long enough to hear from you, and don't know where I shall be next. Guess it doesn't matter much. Adios." With those words, Ambrose Bierce effectively erased himself from the American narrative. He was no longer the famous writer or the aging relative. He was a man operating solely on his own agency, unmoored and drifting toward the center of the storm. He crossed the border into Ciudad Juarez, likely via El Paso, carrying credentials that identified him as a journalist and, according to some reports, a significant sum of money in gold or currency, perhaps as much as $2,000, intended to finance his journey, or perhaps to buy his way into the good graces of the revolutionaries. Juarez was a city transformed by the logistics of war. It was the supply hub for Villa's División del Norte, a place of dust, locomotives, and the ceaseless movement of men and materiel. Bierce successfully attached himself to Villa's army. Despite his advanced age and his history of criticizing revolutionary fervor, his military bearing and his credentials as a famous American writer granted him access. He was issued a pass as an observer, allowing him to travel with the army as it moved south into the vast deserts of Chihuahua. The camp life of the División del Norte was a stark contrast to the regimented existence of the Union Army Bierce remembered. This was an army of the people, organic and chaotic. He was particularly struck by the presence of the soldaderas, the women who accompanied the troops. Unlike the Civil War, where women were largely relegated to the rear or disguised if they wished to fight, the women of the Mexican Revolution were integral to the army's function. They cooked, foraged, nursed the wounded, and often took up arms alongside the men. Bierce observed the soldaderas preparing food over open fires, the smell of roasted meat and corn tortillas mingling with the smoke of the locomotives. He heard the corridos, ballads like La Adelita and La Valentina, sung around the campfires, songs that glorified the bravery and romance of the Revolution. To Bierce, this was both alien and deeply familiar. It was the timeless culture of the soldier, the camaraderie forged in the shadow of death. He noted the reliance on the railroad. The División del Norte was a railway army. Trains were its lifeblood, moving artillery, horses, and water across the inhospitable terrain. Bierce, the old topographical engineer, would have appreciated how the rail lines dictated the strategy of the campaign. Control the tracks, and you controlled the desert. Despite the harsh conditions, scorching days, freezing nights, and the omnipresent dust that aggravated his asthma, Bierce rode with the army. Witnesses reported seeing the old gringo sitting straight in his saddle, maintaining a dignity that commanded respect from the rough revolutionaries. He was moving toward the city of Chihuahua, which Villa had recently captured, and toward a looming confrontation at a place called Tierra Blanca. He was riding directly into the game he had come to see. The Battle of Tierra Blanca, fought south of Ciudad Juarez in late November 1913, was the spectacle Ambrose Bierce had sought. It was a masterclass in maneuver warfare and brutality, a clash that would break the back of the federal forces in Chihuahua and cement Pancho Villa's legend. For Bierce, observing the unfolding violence, it was a validation of his darkest literary themes: war as a mechanic of destruction, indifferent to human suffering. The Federal Army, commanded by General José Inez Salazar, was a formidable force, outnumbering Villa's troops and possessing superior artillery support. They were dug into defensive positions, disciplined and heavily armed. But Villa, operating with an intuitive grasp of the terrain and the psychology of his enemy, possessed a tactical audacity that the Federal commanders could not match. The battle took place on a desolate, sandy plain where the heat shimmered off the ground, distorting the distance and turning men into mirages. The decisive moment of the engagement, a scene of such cinematic violence that it must have resonated with Bierce's own grim imagination, was the deployment of the dynamite train. Rodolfo Fierro, Villa's terrifying lieutenant and executioner known as El Carnicero, the Butcher, devised a plan to turn the railway against the Federals. A steam locomotive was packed with dynamite and percussion caps. Fierro and his men sent the unmanned engine hurtling down the tracks at full throttle, aimed directly at the Federal troop trains and positions. The resulting collision was cataclysmic. The explosion shattered the Federal lines, destroying their rolling stock and sending a shockwave of panic through the ranks. It was a chaotic, industrial form of warfare, a stark departure from the linear infantry charges Bierce had led in 1864. Following the explosion, Villa's cavalry, led by the ruthless Fierro, swept into the disarray. The Federal retreat turned into a rout. Fierro famously rode down the escaping trains on horseback, leaping onto the moving cars, shooting the engineers and boilermen, and bringing the retreat to a halt. The Federal soldiers, trapped and terrified, were slaughtered or captured. Accounts suggest that Bierce was not merely a passive observer. Oral traditions and rumors that filtered back to the U.S. claim that the old man, caught up in the adrenaline of the rout, took up a Mauser rifle and fired at the retreating Federals, allegedly killing an officer at a considerable distance. Whether this is fact or the embellishment of legend, it aligns with the persona of a man who had sheathed his sword in 1865, only to find his hand reaching for it again at the end of his life. The revolutionaries, impressed by the old gringo's steadiness under fire, reportedly presented him with a sombrero as a trophy of his participation. The aftermath was grim. Fierro oversaw the execution of all captured Federal officers and many enlisted men. Bierce witnessed this winnowing of humanity, the quantities of human dust piling up in the desert sun. It was the euthanasia of an army. From the city of Chihuahua, on December 26, 1913, Bierce sent what would be his final communication to the outside world. In a letter to his friend Blanche Partington, transcribed in his secretary Carrie Christensen's notebook, he described the harsh conditions, the freezing nights, the sweltering days, and the Jornada del Muerta, journey of death, of the civilian refugees fleeing the violence. He mentioned the incident at Tierra Blanca and the gift of the sombrero. The letter concluded with a sentence that has become his epitaph. "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Bierce indicated he was moving toward Ojinaga, a town on the Rio Grande that was under siege by the Constitutionalists. The Federal Army was trapped there, backed against the river. It was to be the final stand. Bierce, astride his horse, rode out of Chihuahua City and into the silence of the desert. He was never seen or heard from again by anyone in the United States. The man who had walked into the revolution had been swallowed whole. The darkness that had claimed Ambrose Bierce on the slopes of Kennesaw Mountain in 1864 did not last forever. It eventually yielded to a throbbing, red-tinged consciousness. He was not dead. His brother, Albert Bierce, an officer in the 18th Ohio Battery, had heard of his fall and searched the battlefield until he found Ambrose lying in the dirt, blood matting his hair. Bierce awoke to the agony of the broken walnut. He was lifted from the ground, his head a chaotic drum of pain. The journey from the battlefield was a torture in itself. He was placed in a jarring ambulance wagon that traversed the rutted, shell-torn roads of Georgia, a ride that likely exacerbated the swelling in his brain. From the field hospital, he was loaded onto a hospital train bound for Chattanooga. The heat inside the boxcar was stifling, the air thick with the smell of gangrene and chloroform. He drifted in and out of delirium, his mind unable to process the linear flow of time. He was eventually deposited at the Officers' Hospital on Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. This facility, perched high above the Tennessee River, offered fresh air and stunning vistas, a stark contrast to the stifling valleys below. Here, amidst the clouds, Bierce began the slow, painful process of recovery. But the man who emerged from that hospital was fundamentally altered. The physical wound healed, leaving a scar and a bullet fragment forever lodged in his skull. But the psychological fissure was permanent. He carried the symptoms of his traumatic brain injury, TBI, for the rest of his life. Dizziness, fainting spells, and a profound, erratic irritability that would fuel his legendary cynicism. He had peered into the abyss in 1864, and although he had pulled back, a part of him remained there, waiting. 50 years later, in the deserts of Coahuila, the cycle finally closed. The unknown destination he departed for in December 1913 was not merely a geographic location. It was the final acceptance of the darkness he had cheated half a century earlier. While rumors abounded that he died of pneumonia in El Paso, that he fought in France in WWI, the oral history from the remote mining town of Sierra Mojada offers the most plausible and thematically fitting conclusion. Local legend, meticulously documented by Father James Leonard, speaks of an old gringo who was executed by a firing squad in the town cemetery in early 1914. The story goes that the old man, suspected of being a spy or simply an inconvenience to the local Vilista warlords, was stood against a wall. He refused a blindfold. He did not beg. He stood with the same stoicism he had shown at Kennesaw. When the order to fire was given, the volley of the Mausers echoed the crack of the sniper's rifle that had felled him 50 years before. There is no official record, no body ever recovered and identified. But in the cemetery of Sierra Mojada, a marker was erected decades later. It bears a tribute not to a famous writer, but to a man of character, faithful to his word. Ambrose Bierce did not simply vanish. He completed a narrative arc that began with a bullet in Georgia and ended with a volley in Mexico. The 50 years in between, the journalism, the satire, the ghost stories, were perhaps just a long, lucid dream experienced by a man who had never truly left the battlefield. In the end, the unknown destination was the silence he had been seeking since 1864. The writer laid down his pen, the soldier stood his ground, and the darkness, patient and absolute, finally reclaimed its own.